I am an academic scientist who dedicated my life to study, things that 12 other people in the world cared about, and I thought that was a very nice way to spend my life. And then I woke up one day and realized that everything I'd ever studied no longer existed. That the seagrass beds that I studied in the Chesapeake Bay for my master's degree were gone. That the same was true for most of Florida Bay. The coral reefs of Jamaica, where I met Liz Sides, that were the most spectacularly beautiful coral reefs I think I've ever seen in my life, with about 2/3 of the surface covered by living coral were reduced to 2 or 3% live coral, and the reefs were covered by seaweed, and it was sort of on and on like that, and so you ask yourself, well, what's wrong? And the obvious answer is us, but how is it that we have managed to do so much damage to the ocean that covers most of the surface of the planet is really the question that stands out. This is a really depressing talk. You can leave now if you want. I'd much rather give a talk about solutions than a talk about problems. But you can't solve problems until you admit the problems are there. And look in the mirror and acknowledge what's going on. And governments all over the world are really, really bad at that. And so I'm going to dwell more on the problems than I am on the solutions, because I think that these are things that you people have to come to grips with as much as we have. It's really remarkable just how bad the situation is in the oceans, and you have to ask yourself, well, why is it that we were so far behind? Is it that marine biologists are just second-rate and weren't as smart as tropical ecologists who figured out that rainforests were in trouble a long time ago, or what is it? And part of the problem, of course, is that the oceans are out of sight and out of mind, and the vast majority of people will never see most of what is, or at least was, beautiful in the oceans, except on television. The other part of the problem is this thing that the great Daniel Pauly called the shifting baseline syndrome, which I can explain like this. Everybody thinks that natural is the way the world was when they were a kid. And unnatural is all the depressing stuff that happens as we get older, which is why we older people are a lot more depressing than you younger people. But, of course, the problem is that children never listen to their parents. And so, iteratively, generation by generation, we have lost all concept of what natural means. And it's always interesting to hear people talk about protecting our wonderful fisheries, because there is no place in the world today where the fish populations, at least of the species we care about, are more than a very small fraction of what they used to be. You can think about what you see there in that picture, and we'll get there later on. I like to start with this book. I'm curious, how many people have ever read the book Silent Spring? Oh, you're good. When I ask in universities, about 5%. That's really not bad. I think you're about 25. This book and my former colleague Dave Keeling's measurement of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were the two events that signaled the death of nature. Rachel Carson, of course, described the use and misuse of DDT, and the fact that chemicals like DDT had found their way throughout the entire world. And Dave Keeling showed that carbon dioxide had increased dramatically. And, in the Amazon forest today, I have colleagues who are helicoptered in to places in the forest where no person, not even an indigenous person, lives, where the forest composition is changing because of the changes in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There is no place on Earth that is pristine, and we just have to, as my daughter would say, get over it. Now, this book had an enormous consequence. President Kennedy ordered immediately, get that woman and get her here, and we want to know what she has to say. And she took on the global chemical industry. And she knew that it was not going to be a cozy, warm, fuzzy experience. And so she researched the book very, very carefully. And if you deconstruct Silent Spring, it's essentially just three questions. What's going on now that's new, different, and scary? What will happen to the world if we don't change our ways? And what can we do differently to avoid what's going on? And the sad fact is that as I stand here and give you this talk, that the questions haven't changed, but the answers are even more depressing than they were in 1962 when she published Silent Spring. So what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to ask the same three questions. And in the context of the ocean, we can say, what are the major impacts on the oceans? And there are three. Overfishing. We're essentially, when Columbus discovered America, there were more than a dozen species in the Atlantic that were bigger than his biggest boat. And we laugh at people who talked about sea monsters, but there were, in fact, encounters between whales and boats, and the whales usually won. But we're getting rid of all that, and we're close to the point where there's nothing left in the ocean that's bigger than this. Okay, and then pollution, and then climate change. Let's start out. So I usually talk to Americans and they look at the left, but you can look at the right. Red is good, white is bad. That's how much fish there was in the Atlantic Ocean in 1900. Okay, that's 1900. This is today. Your minister and the European Union is talking about preserving the wonderful fish stocks of Europe. 1900, today. And when you eat fish and chips, the hake you eat, because of course there's no cod, the hake comes from the southern hemisphere because there's practically no hake left in the northern hemisphere. Okay, and it's an amazing figure, right? And we are discussing in our wisdom today whether or not it's time to enforce fisheries regulations. These are UN data. This isn't some hippie environmental organization. This is the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization data, and you can see that today more than half of the fisheries, in fact almost 100% of global fisheries, have crashed, are overexploited, or are fully exploited. And we keep on fishing as if there were no tomorrow. The data on the left are the decline in sharks over a period of 14 years. Those are different species of sharks. The one on the top is hammerhead sharks. Hammerhead sharks have been reduced in the northwestern Atlantic by 94% in 14 years, and they weren't exactly pristine in 1986. And on the right, you see the consequence of the sushi craze, which is the increase in western and central Pacific Ocean tuna catch. We fish as if there were no tomorrow. And I love these pictures. It comes from the work of a student of mine, Lauren McClanahan, who just finished. These pictures are trophy photographs taken over a period of 50 years on the same dock in Key West. People pay a lot of money to get on a boat, go out, drink beer, fish, come back, and the largest fish are hung up on the board to take a photograph and feel good about yourself. In 1956, you can see there were a lot of big fish. Those are what are called Goliath groupers. In the 1970s, there were still quite a few fish. And then you can see down below 2007. Those are the biggest fish caught from a similar boat in the same place. Nothing has changed except the fish. And yet you can see that guy, you know, we would call him, in a place like Florida, we'd call this guy a Bubba, you know. Look at that big fish, you know. And people are paying, in 1956 dollars, twice as much money to catch those tiny little snappers. And they think it's great, you know. That's shifting baselines. These data are from our United States National Marine Fisheries Service. The United States does a lot of things bad when it comes to the environment. We got rid of part of that problem a year ago, but we have a long way to go. But the National Marine Fisheries Service of the United States has, without question, better data and better observation of fisheries than any fisheries organization in the world. Okay? In spite of that, they are responsible for 528 stocks in American waters, and 54% of them, they don't have a clue of how well the stocks are doing. And of the remaining ones, 17% are subject to overfishing, 24% are overfished, 61% are fully fished, which means hope and pray they're not overfished, which means that the world's best data-supported fisheries management organization, at best, knows the condition, it has 28% of its stocks legally in good shape, according to their data, which you can see on their website, which this came from. And the consequence of that is we manage by wishful thinking. So, Alaskan pollock, that's the white, trashy fish that you buy at a McDonald's. It's sort of the American fish and chips. You know, grease and salt, it tastes wonderful. It's the most valuable fishery in the world. It comes from the East Bering Sea. More money is spent studying Alaskan pollock than you can possibly imagine. And these are the trends for Alaskan pollock. And you can see it's shown going up, you know, from the bottom around 2008. Well, that's a model. Okay? Now, imagine I'm in business, and we just had the downturn. And for the last 5 years, my profits are really bad. And my stock is going down. That's what you're looking at, the female spawning biomass, going straight down for 5 or 6 years. And that blue line is maximum sustainable yield, okay? And I'm down below. I go to you, you're my banker. And I say, look, I have a model. And the model says that in 2 or 3 years, I'm going to make money. So I want you to give me money so I can spend more money on my business because, you know, in the future it's going to be great. That's fisheries management, what I just described to you. That model showing the improvement, well, they went out again this year and the stock collapsed. You'll read about it in 3 months. Alaskan pollock will probably have to be closed. As many people will lose their jobs as lost their jobs in Canada. In 92, 35,000 people lost their jobs when the cod collapsed because the government didn't listen to the fisheries biologists who they fired. Okay? And so here we are. We're still doing the same thing in 2009. We've learned nothing. And the effects of all of this on ecosystems are just catastrophic. And I'm just going to mention 3, what's called fishing down the food web, the destruction of the seafloor by trawling, and a rather exotic thing called Trophic Cascades, but just think of it as big fish eat little fish. Fish have trophic levels, you know. Lions and tigers are at the top, cows are sort of down there on the bottom. We like to eat the lions and tigers of the ocean. Cod, sharks, salmon, things like that. And we're not so fond of sardines and whatever. But you can see in these graphs globally and in the North Atlantic that the average trophic level of fish catches is declining dramatically because we're just fishing our way down. And as we do that, we change the names of fishes so that they will sound tastier. The things that had disgusting names in the past and were thrown away now have fancy names, right? I mean, it's the same way that that Patagonian toothfish is now called Chilean sea bass. It's all marketing. Trawling. Trawling, you do a lot of trawling in Northern Ireland, but trawling is an obscenity. Trawling is, imagine you had some enormous American military helicopter and a big, huge chain, and you got some old locomotive, and you attached it to the chain, and you flew over Manhattan Island with the locomotive about 100 feet above street level, toppling buildings. That's trawling. And so you can see after one trawling pass, the deep ocean coral reef turns into sand and rubble. In a single trawling pass, it takes 50 years minimum for that to recover. And just think about this picture. Okay, that's the sea floor. And you can see the troughs in the continental shelf. The area of the global sea floor, which looks like that because of trawling, is greater than the area of all the forests ever cut down on land by people in the history of humanity. That's a lot of trawling. And then Trophic Cascades. Okay, so on the upper left is a hammerhead shark. And hammerhead sharks like to eat these things called cow-nosed rays that are in the middle. And cow-nosed rays like to eat scallops. There used to be a lot of hammerhead sharks, and there used to be a lot of scallops. But as you can see in the upper right, the hammerhead sharks have been fished out. The cow-nosed rays have increased. And the scallop fishery, which was a mainstay of states like North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina, is completely disappeared. And then overfishing, in the beautiful South Pacific, I went on this expedition, and I can tell you that when I saw the place on the left, it was like, oh my God, I haven't seen that for 35 years. That's a place called Kingman Reef, about 1,000 miles south of Honolulu, a place that people forgot, and the U.S. Navy will sink you if you go there. And so fishermen don't go there, and there's lots of sharks, and there's healthy coral. The right is about 500 miles to the south. Overfishing, you notice the huge shark populations on the right, and they're little nubbins of coral. That's all a consequence of fishing and the removal of the fish that eat the seaweed and whatever. Okay, so that's enough about fishing. Let's talk about pollution. Introduced species, poisoning, and the rise of slime. On the radio this morning, all they wanted to talk about is the rise of slime. I think it should have been the name of a punk rock group. I really do. So I don't know if you've ever seen this. If you go snorkeling in the northwestern Mediterranean, this beautiful plant, Caulerpa taxifolia, was introduced by accident into the Mediterranean from the Monaco Aquarium. That's rather embarrassing. And there's a book about it. The book is called Killer Algae. Nothing eats it. It's overgrowing everything. Did you ever see the American movie Little Shop of Horrors? And there's this plant that grows and grows and grows. Well, Caulerpa taxifolia is the Little Shop of Horrors plant. And it is literally carpeting the benthic communities of the northwestern Mediterranean and transferring communities that had hundreds and hundreds of species to just a few. Poisoning, I'll show one disgusting picture, but just contemplate this. Mercury mostly comes from coal. We burn the coal in our power plants. The mercury goes up into the upper atmosphere. It shunts to the north. It comes down in the Arctic. It gets into the food chain, and it works its way right up, So killer whales sort of glow in the dark from mercury. And that gets in the food chain. Now, the Eskimo women, the Inuit women, who eat that traditional food, their breast milk would qualify as a toxic waste from the mercury that they assimilate. Wild salmon in streams in Alaska is full of heavy metals, and that gets into the food chain when they die, and the eagles and the bears. And farm salmon, which you guys do a lot of, and Scotland even more, is fed with all that trash fish from the North Sea, which has accumulated all this stuff. And when kids ask me in class, they say, how much of this stuff can I eat? I say, well, eat it once a month. but don't eat it more than once a month. Not if you want to have children. And then there's toxic algal blooms, which cause the majority of this. On the coast of California today, we see this all the time. This is mostly from toxic dinoflagellate blooms, but some of it is heavy metal. Some of it's also sound pollution. I'm not going to talk about, keeping the world safe for democracy. Boom, boom, stuff like that. And then plastic trash. That, on the left, is an albatross, and all of those tin cans and plastic were in its belly when it died. And on the right, you see in a little petri dish a plankton toe. Plankton, you all know this, but I'm going to say it, right? Plankton are the little plants and animals in the water, right? So you put a net out and you drag the net to see the zooplankton and study them. Anywhere in the world ocean you do that today, you'll get 10 times more plastic than plankton. And we're only just beginning to realize the problem of the small, tiny, microscopic bits of plastic. A bunch of our students just did a cruise to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is an amount of plastic that would probably cover all of Ireland, north and south. And then the rise of slime, which is a function of nutrients. You've got a big lock up here, right? And I hear it's not so very nice anymore. And it's essentially a consequence of the runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from using too much fertilizer that the chemical industry wants you to use. You don't really need it, but it's subsidized. And you make more money by selling fertilizer that people don't need. And so you get this hyper-productivity of plankton. And because you've fished out everything, there isn't anything to eat it. So the stuff happily grows and dies, and then it falls to the bottom and it rots. And in the process of rotting, it uses up all the oxygen. And then any fish or shrimp that were left from all the oxygen being used up, they die. And then you get what's called a dead zone, which is actually not dead. It's jellyfish and bacteria. And we'll get there. So, and part of the problem is the fertilizer, and the other part of the problem is we killed the filter. So, for example, the Chesapeake Bay, Captain John Smith, when he came to America and sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, it blew his mind. And at the time, an oyster, I swear, was this big. You can see them in the archaeological sites. And one oyster was a dinner. And oysters were so abundant that they filtered all the water in the bay every 3 days. And oysters invented the millipore filter. They really filtered the water. But we fished them all out, and so we killed the filter. And so we have these dead zones and jellyfish and bacteria. And on the right, you see the major fishery in all dead zones, jellyfish. So in the Gulf of Mexico, we have a booming jellyfish fishery. In the Benguela Current, there is a booming jellyfish fishery. In the Black Sea, there is a booming jellyfish fishery. And it all goes to Taiwan. But that's because there aren't any fish left. When I started giving these talks in 2001, there were 150 dead zones. There are now more than 400 dead zones. And that's not just better reporting. We're on the tip of the iceberg. And this picture is mind-boggling. It's weird, I won't bother. The lower left-hand corner is the Texas-Mexico border. The upper right-hand corner is almost the Mississippi Delta. You're looking at a picture of an area as big as France and Germany. And that greenish stuff is a single toxic dinoflagellate bloom. It kills fish. It's made by that pretty little creature in the lower right, Corinia brevis. And there's the photograph that I had on my opening slide in the upper right. Mentioned the Shifting Baselines project I did, and we did an event called Hollywood Ocean Night. And there were all these famous movie stars like Dustin Hoffman and Ben Stiller, and I was really nervous. What the hell do you say to people like Dustin Hoffman about the oceans? And I said, so imagine you're in a movie called Escape from Malibu. Malibu is that gorgeous place northwest of LA where all the movie stars live. And because the ocean has become so bad that everybody who can afford it has moved to North Dakota. Now that's like saying move to Siberia, at least in America. And the only people who are left there are street people. And my buddy, the Hollywood guy, said, Jeremy, you've really lost it this time. That upper right-hand corner is Escape from Malibu. That is Karenia brevis. That's a toxic dinoflagellate bloom. It's coming ashore. The breeze gets the droplets of seawater into the air. It drifts ashore, and the hospitals immediately fill up with acute asthma attacks. Schools are closed. That's today. That's a real photograph. That's Escape from Malibu. The only difference is that it's in Florida. Fish kills. I mean, you know, a billion fish. Smells. Okay, and then climate change. And I'm going to go over this briefly because you all know about climate change, right? And the two big things are it's getting hotter and it's getting acid. Okay. My colleagues down the hall at Scripps are responsible for the Pacific Ocean data. The pH of the Pacific Ocean, which is a big body of water, has declined 1/10 of a pH unit in the last decade. This stuff I'm talking about is stuff we measure. This isn't freaky stuff. This is science. This is real. We measure it in real time. And, you know, so what's going on? The ice caps are rapidly melting. Summer sea ice will disappear in the Arctic. When I first, 5 years ago, I said summer sea ice will disappear in the Arctic within 50 years. Then it was 30 years. Now it's 20 years, but it's really 10 years. And those oil companies who have been saying that climate change is a figment of radical imagination are quietly planning to send their supertankers through the Arctic Ocean because it's the short way to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And they know it's true. And they know it's true all along. Ecosystems epitomized by polar bears and penguins are toast. Species ranges are galloping towards the poles. Tropical corals are dying because of bleaching and disease. And calcifying organisms like coral snails and most scarily plankton are gravely threatened because the oceans are becoming more acidic. The way to think about it is, imagine in a world with no seashells on the beach because they're dissolved. Permanent sea ice disappearing. I mean, how many people lost their lives trying to find the Northwest Passage? It'll be gone in 10 years. Polar bears, you know, WWF and everybody say, oh, polar bears are going to go extinct. No, they're just going to, you know, polar bears are white grizzly bears. They'll just hang around garbage dumps and eat babies and dogs and whatever. But I'm sure there's a future for polar bears. The Humboldt squid, which tastes very good, its northern limit of distribution was the Mexico-California border 10 or 15 years ago. It's now in Alaska. The lower left is coral bleaching. You know how that works, right? The symbiotic algae in the coral. They give sugar to the coral gives nutrients to the algae. When it gets too hot, the algae can't make the sugar. Coral says, you didn't pay the rent. They kick out the algae, and then the corals die because they can't live without the algae. And imagine you go camping somewhere in a forest, and you wake up in the morning, in the summertime, and you wake up in the morning, and 80% of all the trees have lost their leaves. And you come back home and you read in the paper that, and I know this for North America, but from here to Moscow and from Sweden to southern Italy, 80% of all the trees have lost their leaves. And then a month later, you read in the Irish Times, oh, by the way, a quarter of those trees died. In other words, in one day, 20% of all the trees in Europe died. Well, the Indian Ocean is the same size as Europe. And in 1 week, during the 1998 El Nino, 80% of the corals in the Indian Ocean bleached, and a quarter of those died. Did you read about it? You did? Okay. And then the lower right is, those are coccoliths. Coccoliths are the most important primary producers in temperate and subpolar seas. The white cliffs of Dover are made of the skeletons of coccoliths. On the left, those two, you see what healthy coccoliths look like. On the right, you see what they look like when you put them in lower pH. pHs that we will achieve in 20, 25 years. Okay, so to summarize all of this incredibly cheerful information, what we're looking at is the ecological extinction of everything we value in the ocean. And population explosions of species that used to be uncommon, and they're increasing whether we like them or not. The way I like to think of it is, who will be the rats and cockroaches of the oceans? Okay, and then the third thing is, these communities we don't like are becoming stabilized because of positive feedbacks. The Earth is going to get a lot warmer fast when all the summer sea ice disappears in the Arctic, because instead of being white and reflecting the sun, it's going to be dark and it's going to absorb the energy, and then it'll get hotter even faster. That's a positive feedback. Okay, Rachel Carson's second question. Remember, what's going to happen with business as usual? It's very simple. We can just have this little graph. There used to be, so then and now. There used to be a lot of big animals. Well, you know what happened to them? We ate them. There used to be a lot of three-dimensional structure, coral reefs, kelp forests, salt marshes, seagrasses. They lasted longer, but they're disappearing all over the world. And what are we getting? We're getting slime, dead zones, bacteria. Okay, so what's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years? Everybody has a plan for 2012, and they have a plan for 2020, and nobody's done anything, right? I mean, we're supposed to hit our targets for biodiversity conservation globally by 2012. Well, forget it. I mean, it's a figment of imagination. Well, business as usual, forget fish. Most fish species will be rare. The ocean is stratifying. As it gets, warmer, water is lighter. And the sun shines on the surface, so the water is getting warmer. There's all that cold water down below. The mixing of the ocean happens because of upwelling, which is driven by circulation patterns and the energy balance on the surface of the Earth. It's harder to mix an ocean that has lighter water on the surface. And we're measuring that in the California current. Upwelling rates in the California current are declining markedly. That means less shunting of nutrients from deep water. That means less downwelling of oxygen to the deep sea. In other words, the whole deep ocean could go anoxic. And if you think that's imaginary, we know that that's happened in the past in geological time. The world has not always been the way it is. We know there have been events of deep ocean deoxygenation. The biggest one was the end of the Permian, when 95% of all the species on Earth went extinct. Acidification, I think of it as Coca-Cola ocean. The decline of most calcified organisms. Coastal water is too toxic for aquaculture. So the great hope, right, is the really smart stuff that happens here in Ireland, right? And I think north as well as south. I know it's in the south because I had a student named Terry Hughes who used to do that sort of thing. I mean, farming oysters and mussels and clams is really good and really smart if you do it the right way. But imagine there's toxic dinoflagellate blooms and you don't have very good regulation and they can sell the stuff anyway. Well, then eating oysters, which I love to do, becomes gastronomic Russian roulette. Sometimes you live, sometimes you get very sick, and maybe you die. So toxic blooms are not really a very good thing for aquaculture. And then there's this whole business of the increasingly uncertain changes in the global biogeochemical cycles. Remember, when the Earth began 4.5 billion years ago, there was no free oxygen. And there have been periods of time when oxygen was more and times when oxygen was less. The abundance of oxygen in the atmosphere and the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle and all those things are driven by biogeochemical processes that we are playing with. We are doing an experiment with an N of one Earth that has potential consequences we do not begin to understand. Okay, so how do we go off and sing Kumbaya? You're going to laugh at this. I wish the minister were still here, right? I mean, because these are the 3 slides for the minister. Okay, there is no such thing as sustainable development. It's an oxymoron. There are too many people, and there's no way you're going to make more of them sustainably. Period. End of discussion. So the way we live is not sustainable. And the commitment to make the change is just, it's mind-boggling. I mean, so we just had cash for clunkers in the U.S., which was a good thing, I guess. It took the Hummers off the road, I mean, because not many people, like our governor, the Terminator, who actually turned out to be an environmentalist, and he put hybrid engines in all his Hummers, but most people don't have the bank account of Arnold Schwarzenegger. So the first step is to get rid of the clunkers. The second step is to get a hybrid. But the third step is to take the bus, right? Which is inconvenient and nobody wants to do it. But forget private cars. Forget that as a way of living. I mean, it's not good. Okay, and then we have, so accept the way we live, and then those other things, address simultaneously those 3 big problems. And I can't say this enough, none of this will be possible without fundamental changes in what you expect out of life and how we get energy for everything we do. Okay, fishing. Make fishing ecologically responsible. Now, what does that mean, besides just a lot of talk? It means to strengthen and enforce laws. That means putting fishermen in jail if they do what they shouldn't do, and eliminate all of the subsidies for fishing, and eliminate overfishing. We subsidize overfishing in Europe and North America and Japan. We subsidize it handily. Ban harmful fishing practices. No more trawling. No more longlining. And you laugh. I mean, what are the chances of banning trawling in Northern Ireland? Well, I can tell you, if you don't ban trawling, you won't have any fish. There isn't any in between. And when people say, let's be reasonable, is it reasonable to, promote the destruction of what you have? No, it's not. But it's what we call reasonable. Establish very large marine protected areas. That's a big goal of the Ulster Wildlife Trust. There is one successful system of marine protected areas in the world on the scale that is necessary, and that's the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. The oldest system like that in the world. It was failing. The Great Barrier Reef was getting worse, so the Australian government had the guts and the courage to say 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef, forget it. You cannot use it. except to go swim or look. The equivalent of that would be to say 1/3 of the coast of the western United States, or 1/3 of the coast of Europe, and people are arguing about postage stamps. But I can tell you that all of what we know about fishing and ecosystems says that if you want positive results, you need 35% of the global ocean completely protected, period. We're going to get 15% in California in the next year, and that's a good start. Okay. And then support the development of environmentally responsible aquaculture. I mean, farming salmon is raising cattle to feed to lions and tigers to eat lions and tigers, right? Because salmon are apex predators like lions and tigers. I suppose we're not going to give that up because but at least we can feed them vegetables and then stick a little chemical in there and make it taste like fish. I mean, because we trawl the entire North Sea every year for the trash fish to turn in Esbjerg in Denmark, the world's second largest fish meal factory, to take the trash fish, which are sucked out of the ships with a vacuum, to turn it into disgusting slurry like garum in the Roman Empire. And then it comes out at the end, sort of like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It comes out at the end as very pretty-looking perfumed tablets that come in a brightly colored bag, which is sold as 40% fish meal. That's how we feed salmon. Okay. Agriculture and industry, ecologically responsible. If you want to use fertilizer, you should pay a tax. If you want to use a pesticide, you should pay a tax. If you have a pig farm or a chicken farm, you should pay a tax for every bit of chicken poop that you stick out in the environment. It's a huge problem, industrial farming, animal waste. Agricultural subsidies. Now, this is really funny in Europe. Get rid of them. Right? And ban outright the use of persistent pesticides and chemical waste that harm ecosystems and human health. The great thing to tell male ministers is that the sperm count in the developed world is down 40 to 50% in the last couple of decades because of a chemical called atrazine, which you've now banned in Europe, but you've got the similar chemical that's got a few carbons and the hydrogen's different, and then, that's legal until proven that it's bad too, and then you go to the next one, and you go to the next one. So all you guys have your babies soon. And the most important scientific challenge with regard to agriculture is to make the so-called green revolution green. Because it's a catastrophe. It's based on overuse of fertilizer we don't need. The excess fertilizer use gives a return of 10 or maybe 50% more production. And then make energy use ecologically responsible. I mean, enforce the regulations, tax the hell out of it. I mean, you pay a lot more for petrol than we do, but it's probably too cheap by a factor of 2 or 3. Make it really, really, really hurt to buy petrol. Provide powerful incentives. Well, price, that's an incentive. And fast track the development of alternative green energy. And get rid of the CO2. I hate technical solutions because it becomes the Bjorn Lomborg will techno-fix our way out of all our problems. But we've got to get rid of the CO2 because we are committed to a hot house world already. We've got to figure out how to get rid of that CO2. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I will. I've come to the conclusion that, the Sophie's choice, the dilemma is, do we continue to use carbon-based fuel, which is destroying the world today, or do we use nuclear power, which maybe will destroy the world in 500 years. And it seems we have two choices other than carbon-based, and that's solar, because wind is sort of a boutique source of energy. It's really good here where you've got a lot of wind. It's really good in Denmark. It's really good in California, but there are a lot of places it just won't do it. So it's either solar or nuclear or Armageddon. I mean, that's the choice. So, I'm done. The oceans and the climate, I hope you will believe at the end of this uplifting talk, are in a crisis. And the changes are happening faster and faster and faster. The problems are 99.99999% political. They are not scientific. We know what we need to do to reverse the trends. We do not need more data. We do not need more studies. Sure, it's always nice. It employs scientists. You know, scientists can sell out like whores to say, oh yeah, give me some money, I'll go study. But we don't need to study anymore to know what to do about the problem. We stop fishing, at least for a while. But it's not just the fishermen, it's not just the oil companies, it's all of us. All of us are responsible. And the driving force is the way we live. And if we're not willing to change, then we're all going to suffer. The alternative is a hothouse world. You know, when he started, I'm going to blank on his name, Mr. Gaia, was labeled, Lovelock, was labeled as a raving lunatic. The notion that the Earth system, the coupling between biology and physics and chemistry was fundamental, and that you couldn't understand the way the Earth worked unless you looked at the integration. Why are all the climate models too conservative? Not radical, too conservative? Because the climate models don't include biology. The warming is happening faster than the models. The stratification of the ocean is happening faster than the models. The melting of ice in Greenland is happening faster than the models because they don't incorporate the nonlinear dynamics of biology. A hothouse world means half of the terrestrial landscape without sufficient water to live. A hothouse world means that, the entire southwest of the United States, including the state of Texas, which sort of makes me feel good, are going to be absolutely uninhabitable. They're uninhabitable now, but that's a point of view. Okay. Billions of climate refugees. Hurricanes are getting stronger because of global warming. Bangladesh has 20 years, maybe, as a nation. Where are those 150 or 200 million people going to go when their neighbors don't like them? And how are we going to respond to that fact? Okay, so the question that I leave you with is whether or not we can overcome human nature, greed, corruption, ignorance, and inertia to do something. Or will we wait for a crisis? My pessimistic view is that we will try and we'll make some progress, but I dare say that some really big crisis is going to hit it first. And in my country, that will be a Category 5 hurricane in Miami or New York City, and that will do more damage than all the insurance companies in the world can pay off. And then we'll have refugees in our country that will make Katrina look like a picnic. My view is that it's going to take that to get us moving. But if you are all successful in the Ulster Wildlife Trust, you can prove me wrong, and that would be a very happy thing. Thank you very much.
Sure.
if there are any questions, I'm happy to do it. You can shoot me.
You say that the problems are 99% political and not scientific, but we have a large body of scientists in the health professional world who are urging us to eat more and more fish because it's good for health.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
And this is one of the great puzzles of modern life to me, that here we are emptying our oceans of fish because health professionals are telling us to do this.
Well, that's not why we're doing it. We're emptying.
I know that, but
we're emptying the oceans of fish because a lot of people like to eat fish, and here in a prosperous part of the world, fish is to some degree a luxury. In the tropical developing world, reef fish and mangrove fish are the most important source of protein throughout Southeast Asia. So it's a huge problem. It's easy for me to say stop fishing, but for those people it's... But figure out a way to make omega-3 fatty acids some way other than, or not, some way other than doing that. I did what I swore I wouldn't do, which was violate. Eat sardines and anchovies. That's one of the few sustainable fisheries in the world, It's fascinating. If there is a sustainable fishery in the world, it's the Peruvian anchoveta. After overfishing during a bunch of El Niños, they finally got it right. They shut it down now, when it's looking bad. And that's really good and healthy. And you know what we do with the anchoveta? We grind it up to feed to salmon. So if we ate it, and they do taste good, instead of grinding it up to make salmon, we could probably meet a pretty significant proportion of the need. But there's no doubt that the physicians, from their point of view, are giving good advice. It's healthier to eat that than beef or pork. But from the point of view of the ocean, it's a disaster. And DDT is the same way. I've lived much of my life in malarial nations. And malaria is a tragedy. And DDT, without question, or chemicals like it, is a powerful tool in the fight against breeding mosquitoes that carry malaria. And so, it's a Solomon-like decision. If we could ever learn to do things in moderation, it would go a long way. If in California we shut down certain fisheries for a while, if my government has the courage to shut down the Alaskan pollock fishery for, say, 3 or 5 years, and if they allow it to come back taking 500,000 metric tons a year instead of 1 million metric tons, we can have pollock forever. But if we don't show that moderation, then we'll never.
Howard.
Is it working? Yeah. You probably label this as a techno-fix, Jeremy, but amongst several things I do, I sit on the UK Government's Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment. And through your talk, you haven't yet talked about GMOs and the potential they might have, because I see companies like Monsanto spending huge amounts of money on these replacements for plants that otherwise we need to spray with pesticides.
Well, believe it or not, I don't see anything wrong with GMOs. After all, Darwin's insights in the process of evolution came from animal and plant breeding experiments, among other things. And the probable ancestor of corn can be seen, teosinte, there's an ethnobotanical garden in Oaxaca in Mexico, and the grain is the ear of the proto-corn is about that big. It didn't get from there to there and edible and into tortillas without enormous selection. If we can modify organisms to grow faster, or salmon to be vegetarians by choice, or any of those things, that's fine. Of course, GMOs have their price when they're released over enthusiastically. Weed-resistant varieties of certain plants turn into pests and all the rest of it. So one would like to think that we check, because Atlantic salmon was led into the Pacific through one of the biggest snow jobs that the world has ever seen, swearing they would never escape. And now Atlantic salmon are more abundant than some species of native salmon in parts of the northwestern Pacific part of the U.S. And it's a disaster. And so you'd want to see some caution, but I'm a huge believer in aquaculture, and most of my environmentalist friends scream at me and say, Jeremy, how can you do that? Well, people have to eat something. And I think that responsibly done, aquaculture is the way of the future in the ocean. And half of the fish, I think we're up to 50% or 47% already is farmed. Of course, it's all in China, and statistically speaking, and it's mostly tilapia and carp. Tilapia is tasteless, just like cake and all the rest of it. And it's a very healthy product. We're just going to have to do it.
You just said people have to eat something. Is that not the basic problem? That there are 2 to 3 times as many people on the Earth as there should be in relation to the Earth as a whole ecosystem?
Well, I don't know how many people there should be. And when I give talks in developed countries, I shy away from speaking about population in some ways because I think the immediate problem is consumption. Look at my country. The consumption rate, the use of energy in the United States on a per capita basis is disgraceful. And what's it to produce? It's to produce the junk in Walmarts that people buy and never use. So we could make enormous progress moderating patterns of consumption. And because issues of population are so controversial from a religious perspective for half the people in the world, it's easier to talk about consumption than it is to talk about population. Especially because the best news we've got for the future is that population is growing much more slowly than we thought it was going to. And we now think we're going to level off at a horrific 9 billion instead of something like 12 or 13 billion. And where we got that wrong, apparently, is that people, when they become prosperous, stop having so many children. And you can analyze that however you want, but the birth rate goes way down with prosperity. And so there seems to be an inherent mechanism to achieve some kind of balance if we can distribute prosperity more equitably. But that then, of course, makes the challenge of austerity in the developed world even all the greater. Because if we find ourselves actually sharing what we've got, the poison is going to be a lot worse. But the consumption patterns are just amazing. You have Walmart in Northern Ireland. You're lucky. Yeah. Okay, so you go into one of those places and you look at what they have, and I would venture a bet that 50% of it you have no idea what anybody would do with it. But it got made somewhere and it's sold for something and it gave somebody a job. And it uses energy. So that's where this whole business of lifestyle, I think, really impinges. And I just would feel very self-righteous telling people in some place with a standard of living, a 20th of what I've got, that they should stop having children so I can keep, driving Hummers. Yeah.
Gentleman in a stripy shirt.
Okay, and then the woman in purple.
I was just wondering what main advice you would give to children, or what do you think we should be teaching children?
Well, I think all of this really is political. And so I think it's really a matter of standing up for what you think is right. I mean, so I'm 66 years old, and I've seen, in the United States, I've seen 4 great movements in my lifetime. The first was when a woman refused to go to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and we have an African-American president. The second was the Vietnam War and bringing Lyndon Johnson to his knees. Kids, that's my generation. The third was the women's movement, and the fourth was smoking. Who would believe that in a period of 50 years, 55 years, all those things could happen? When I look at the students I teach now, they seem very conservative to me. We went to jail. You know, I mean, we stood up for a lot and we saw some change. In my country, the most encouraging thing, I live in a place called La Jolla, California, which is where old, rich people go to die. And every time I've ever voted before, the average age of people in the voting line has been around 65. And in November 2008, the average age of people in the voting line was 25. Now, we'll see whether or not the goods live up to the expectations. But there was a result because of a major political will. If kids want it to be different, then they have to fight for it. I mean, it's not going to happen any other way. The gentleman who is here has constituents of all kinds. And it's his job to listen to everybody. You make him worry about whether or not he'll have a job, and he'll listen to you more. I think everything else pales by comparison. I mean, you can unscrew your light bulbs. You can walk instead. It's really funny in Scripps. I live in Southern California and I don't drive. I'm an endangered species. It used to be when I started riding the bus in California, it was me and the domestic servants. Now it's me, the domestic servants, a lot of students, which is great. And I have 2 colleagues at Scripps who take the bus as well. One is the director, and the other one is a man named Ramanathan, who you may have read about in the news because he's the Indian gentleman who has described what he calls atmospheric brown cloud, has done this extraordinarily important work on atmospheric pollution, and is personally responsible for a program to replace charcoal burning cooking fires in India with solar stoves. And it looks like in a few years he's going to achieve the impossible, and Delhi will be clear at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's so interesting that that's the guy that takes the bus, you know? But, I mean, in Southern California, I can tell you it's a pain in the ass not to drive. But it's important. So think about how you live.
Right, we can overrun by a little bit. Refreshments are going to be available in the foyer from about 4 till maybe 4:45 or something like that. So if you're willing, we can take another 5 to 10
I woke up.
5 to 10 minutes.
I have no idea what time it is in California.
Thank you.
I'm not wanting to disagree with what you have said today about cod, but a fishman comes to my local market once a week with good-sized cod fillets, and I keep asking him, where are they from? Where are you getting them? And he tells me the North Sea.
There's some cod. But, you know, those data I showed you didn't come from a radical organization. They came from the United Nations. And it's so hard to understand the quantity. You used to have a lot of herring in Ireland, right? We used to have a lot of herring in New England. The amount of herring caught on a single tide in the Charles River, where Harvard University is, in the 17th century, by weirs, was greater than the entire herring catch in the northeastern United States last year. The shifting baselines problem is beyond belief. Of course, there's still a few fish. But the amount of fish there is, compared to the amount there used to be, is just vanishingly small. And if we allow people to continue to do this, they're going to catch the last fish. And then you won't have any, and there won't be any left in the Southern Ocean either, because that's already being diminished. So sure, you can find it. I mean, you can catch cod off the coast of Maine, you know, and they look nice and they taste good. But look at the photographs of cod from the turn of the, say, 1900, drying, you know, for the way the Spaniards like to eat it, bacalao, dried cod. And the cod are about this long, up to my chin. And as far as the eye can see, they're sitting out on stakes being dried. That's abundant fish, not a few little cod. I've gone cod fishing. I mean, I do go out in the field to see. So I go out with fishers, and I see what they catch. And sure, you can catch a few. In Labrador and Newfoundland, you can catch a few cod. You can catch a lot more dogfish. But you can catch 0.1% or 1% of what you used to get. So it's a matter of degree. And one of the most fascinating things about this shifting baselines problem is a woman who's in Mexico who went out and interviewed people who fish in the Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California. And she asked people of all ages, how's the fishing compared to the way it used to be? The young people said without question the fishing was great. The people who were 65, 70 years old said the fishing was horrible. When asked whether or not they had to go any farther to catch fish than they used to, the young people said, no, we always have to go out there. The old people said, I used to catch it right here. Did you ever see the movie The Perfect Storm? It's a story about these people who go out into the middle of the ocean to catch swordfish. As recently as 125, 150 years ago, those fishermen from New England going out to catch swordfish would row a boat 100 meters offshore, stand in the boat with a harpoon, and harpoon 10-foot-long swordfish. I could show you photographs. Okay? And now they have to go to the center of the ocean and die in a storm. I don't think there's still a lot of swordfish there for them to row out in their boat, because they wouldn't go out there if they didn't need to do it. Fishermen today could fight a war. They have $10,000, $20,000 worth of electronics in their boat. They can see the fish way down in the deep water on their sonar. They can locate them. The tuna boats, a single large bluefin tuna that's never frozen is worth $150,000 in the Tokyo fish market. At $150,000 a fish, you can have a helicopter, you can fly around, you can find where it is, you can go out and you can get it. With that kind of money driving it, and with that kind of technology, we will continue to find things. But you have to believe me, the difference is just remarkable.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to try to fit in three. There's a gentleman in the third row from the back.
And while the person is getting the microphone, do an experiment. Go to a discount food store. And if you have truth in advertising laws in Northern Ireland that require them to tell you where the fish came from, you look. Because unless it's very different from the United States, you will find that the fish that you're buying in the store comes from places thousands and thousands of miles away.
Professor Jackson, my name is Alan McCullough, and for almost 42 years I've been involved in the fishing industry here in Northern Ireland, the last 17 of which have been representing the industry here. Certainly, given what you've just said, I would love to be representing the kind of fishing industry that you've described with helicopters and modern vessels. Our fleet in Northern Ireland is comprised of about 60% fewer trawlers now than what we had 15 years ago. Those trawlers...
Trawlers?
Trawlers, yeah.
Yeah, right. That scrape the bottom of the ocean.
They have an average age of 30 years. I think the point that I'm trying to make, you referred to your last president in the United States, Mr. Bush. And of course, just as Mr. Bush is not typical of the population of the USA, the kind of fishing industry that you're portrayed is not typical the world over, and is certainly not typical in the REC. I did thoroughly enjoy your presentation, Professor Jackson. I have one regret, as always, about these seminars organised by the Ulster Wildlife Trust, and that is when good people like yourself are invited to Northern Ireland, you don't get the opportunity maybe to visit those of us on the coast and that are at the cold face every day, and who would be very, very happy to listen to what you have to say and debate it with you. You threw down a challenge towards the end of your presentation, and that was to prove you wrong. And in the few minutes that we have available this afternoon, there's no way I can prove that you're wrong. But just a few bullet points for the audience. Around the UK and Ireland, less than 30% of the seabed is fished, is trawled. That's at least 70% that isn't fished. You mentioned cod in relation...
just for clarification, isn't trawled, but that doesn't mean it isn't fished. Is it long-lined?
No, there's no long lining.
There's no long lining.
I think the point, what struck me during the presentation was I hesitate to say it, but it seems that we in Europe, we in the UK and Ireland, are several years in advance of the United States of America when it comes to fisheries management, even to the extent, Professor Jackson, that we do put fishermen into jail here as well. But in answer to the question from the lady in front with regard to cod, the type of vessels that used to target cod, through the management of the European Union, which we can debate its pros and cons, but the effort that those vessels have put in the REC within the last 10 years has been cut by 84%. The amount of cod that we can catch, not the amount of cod that's in the sea, but the amount of cod that we can catch has been cut in the last 10 years by over 90%.
Well, was it, so, I mean, if you're going to go on, I want to comment as you make the comments. If it's been cut by, what did you say, 84%, it hasn't been cut by 84% because the fishery was in good shape. It was cut by 84% because there was a problem. Because surely, if the fish stocks were in good shape, why would you conceivably ask the people to cut their income and their catch by such a huge amount?
Well, apologies if you believe that I'm going on. I certainly don't want to take up any time, but I don't think anybody within the fishing industry will deny that there isn't a problem with the cod stock. And that is, unfortunately, the bad news story. The good news stories are, however, with the herring that you've mentioned. Herring is, I think, in the terms of ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, a green light fishery, as is plaice in the REC, as is prawns in the REC, our most important fishery. And what has replaced cod in the ecosystem is a strange fishery that there was an abundance of in the North Sea and other areas, but only over the past 15 years has moved into the REC, a fish called haddock, Professor Jackson. So yes, I'm not denying, as a fisherman's representative, that there aren't problems out there. What I will say is that the fishing industry, unlike what it seems to me you have in America, has taken massive steps over the past few years to address those problems. And the tide is turning. There is recovery out there. There is good news. And I think it's the good news, is the positive story, really, that we need to look at as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to come in here because this particular conversation could go on for a long time. We're very much hoping that Professor Jackson will be dining tonight with some people who represent fisheries and we're hoping to meet Michelle.
But let me say one thing.
So,
lobster has become the cash fishery in New England. And the rising dominance of invertebrates, prawns, lobster, squid, and the like, is exactly what Daniel Pauly described as the consequence of fishing down the food chain. Prawns and lobster are worth a lot of money. The danger of those kinds of fisheries is that they are the kind of fishery that prospers in a grossly altered ecosystem. We're sitting looking at the lobster fishery in New England, crossing our fingers that the lobsters are going to hold because the livelihood of all those people is dependent upon that. But the stability of crustacean invertebrate fishing over any kind of long term is highly questionable. There have been lots of failures, and I hope you have better luck than most other people have had. And I'm not just talking about the US, I'm talking about Australia and the prawn fishery that had to be shut down there and all the rest of it. It's very, very dicey.
I think I'm going to take one last quick question, I trust, from the gentleman in the white jacket.
Thank you. About a year ago, very roughly, I attended a European environmental advisory conference in Bordeaux. And that was at the time when the economic crisis was just about kicking in and banks were going down like dominoes. And the conference came up with the view and an appeal that because we had a crisis, could we turn this into an opportunity and actually completely rethink the way we managed the world's economics so that we didn't go through this again and we put ourselves on a sustainable basis. Well, a year later, in the news over this side of the pond, we now know that British borrowers are now paying back slightly more than they're actually borrowing at present. And this is regarded as a cause of concern by some authorities because it means that we're not going to keep on borrowing more to buy more stuff, etc. And it really depresses me when I hear that news, and we are very, very far from having any long-term sustainable objectives in our economic system. And I wonder whether at your side of the Atlantic, coming from California, which is noted for its consumption, whether there's any glimmer of hope that there is some rethinking.
Noted for its consumption, for sure. I mean, what is the definition of a depression? A depression is when economic growth slows down to zero. In other words, the fundamental definition of economic well-being is more growth. I mean, how we resolve that is you put your finger on the key question. I mean, because whether the gentleman about the fisheries is more right than me about one thing or another, the fact of the matter is we're sort of at our limits all around us. And yet our mantra is to keep growing. Grow ourselves out of the recession. Grow ourselves out of this. Grow ourselves out of that. That's all we know how to do. It's Keynesian. I mean, and it's worked really well for a long time. But those gloomy slides I had about making fisheries responsible, making agriculture responsible, and whatever, implicit in those is a departure from the mindset of continued growth. And the person who figures out how to do that will get a Nobel Prize in economics. Because everybody knows it's the elephant in the room. That we simply don't know how to function as a society without growth. And I obviously don't have an answer. And I can assure you that the surfers in Southern California don't have an answer either.